Have you ever wondered why some of the emptiest people, those utterly devoid of real wisdom, manage to climb so high in the social hierarchy? Why they so often become leaders, role models, voices of authority? The answer begins with a fundamental concept of Jungian psychology, the persona. Carl Jung defined the persona as the mask we wear to interact with the world. It is the public face of our psyche, what we show in order to be accepted, loved, understood. At some level, we all have a persona. It is necessary. Without it, we could not live in society. But the problem arises when we identify completely with that mask, when we stop being who we are and become instead what the world expects us to be. People who gain power are often not the wisest, most sensitive, or most ethical. Rather, they are those who have developed an extremely seductive persona. They know exactly what to say. They know how to carry themselves. They read the collective expectation and offer precisely what people want to hear. Yet behind that performance often lies an enormous inner emptiness. Jung warned us, the persona can become a prison. When an individual identifies too much with the mask, he loses contact with the self, his true, spontaneous core, connected to the unconscious. And the greater the success of the persona, the deeper that disconnection can grow. We live in an era in which image is worth more than substance. Social media, personal branding, ready-made speeches. We are surrounded by polished personas that are extremely fragile. And it is in this context that foolish minds ascend to power, because power today is often a matter of performance rather than depth. Think about it for a moment. How many times have you been drawn to someone charismatic, someone who seemed to have all the answers, only to discover later that there was something shallow there, something constructed, artificial? This happens because the persona is seductive. It feeds our desires, makes us feel seen, represented, but it does not reveal who the other really is. On the contrary, it often hides that truth. Jung said, "The persona is that which someone is not, but which they think they are." That observation perfectly describes how the modern world works. The danger is that the more society values the mask, the more it rejects authenticity. And so, little by little, the most performative, not the most genuine, become our leaders. But what does this say about us? Why do we let ourselves be deceived so often? The answer perhaps lies not only in the persona of the other, but in our own. Because in some way, we are also wearing masks. We are also acting. And when we see someone with a well-crafted persona, we admire what we would like to uphold more firmly within ourselves. The rise of foolish minds to power is not only their fault, it also reflects our own inner disconnection. When we stray from the self, we become more vulnerable to illusion, and the persona of another becomes a mirror, onto which we project our own lacks, our own unfulfilled desires. So before judging the one who deceives, one must ask, at what point did I wish to be deceived? At what moment was it more comfortable to follow a mask than to confront the truth? This is the first key to understanding why the most foolish and seemingly brilliant minds get so far. They are not geniuses, they are reflections of a world that often prefers the shine of appearance to the depth of being. Now that we have begun to uncover the gears of this dynamic, let us move to a deeper level of the psyche, the collective shadow. Because if the persona is the mask that seduces, the shadow is that which controls us without our noticing. And therein lies one of the most dangerous forces behind the ascent of the empty ego to power. If the persona is the mask that mesmerized the public, the shadow is what the public preferred not to see in themselves. Carl Jung taught us that we all carry a shadow. It represents everything we reject in ourselves. Our destructive impulses, repressed anger, envy, vanity, desire for domination. And the less conscious we are of the shadow, the more it governs us from the depths of the psyche. But this shadow is not only individual. There is also a collective shadow, a psychic field shared by a group, a nation, a culture. It emerges when entire communities repress the same contents: fear, violence, intolerance, desire for control. And like everything repressed, it must find a way to express itself. This is precisely where manipulative leaders, often foolish, impulsive, or narcissistic, become icons. They embody, without filters, what the majority pretends it does not carry. And precisely for this reason, they become hypnotic. They say what no one wants to admit thinking. They shout what many whisper in silence. They validate the collective unconscious, even if that means breaking with what is ethical or rational. Jung said, "The meeting of many individual shadows forms the collective shadow, and when that shadow is ignored, it organizes itself, finding its mouthpieces, its symbols, its stages." Think of historical moments when dangerous leaders rose to power with visceral, polarizing, violent speeches. Those leaders were not imposed. They were invited, called onto the stage by a sick collective unconscious that needed to vomit its shadow somewhere. And this does not belong only to the past. It lives on today. But this phenomenon is not limited to politics or grand arenas. The collective shadow can manifest in religious groups, social movements, companies, families. Whenever a group denies its own densest impulses, it begins to look for someone to express them on its behalf. And when that someone appears, they are received with fervor. Often these figures of power are not even aware of the function they fulfill. It is not uncommon for them to be unconscious manipulators, merely intuitively sensing what the masses want to hear. They do not construct a strategy. They embody an unconscious, and the more intensely they do so, the more power they receive. Jung knew the danger of this. That is why he said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." That quotation, so often repeated in personal contexts, applies even more urgently to the collective, because when the collective shadow takes control, there is no dialogue. There is only reaction. And what is most worrying, that reaction is seductive. It provides relief, because releasing what has been repressed for so long gives a false sense of catharsis. But that catharsis comes at a high cost. It feeds empty egos with the power of the unconscious masses. It transforms fragile minds into monstrous leaders, and it drives us further away from the possibility of individuation, both individually and socially. When we follow someone who embodies our shadow, we think we are being protected, guided, strengthened. But in truth, we are only drifting away from the most important work of life, facing what is dark within us. And here arises an uncomfortable but necessary question. What is in me that vibrates when someone shouts? What in me takes pleasure in seeing another humiliated, punished, exposed? What in me feels more alive when the other is destroyed? These questions are not simple, but they are the ones that free us. Because as long as the shadow is denied, it will guide us blindly. And where the shadow leads, power corrupts. Within each person there exists a psychic center that seeks balance. The ego. It organizes consciousness, defines the sense of identity, helps navigate the external world. The ego is essential. But Jung was clear. The problem is not the ego itself. It is when it loses contact with the self, with the psychic totality, and begins to see itself as the whole. This is what we call ego inflation, a phenomenon in which the individual becomes internally hypertrophied, taken over by a feeling of greatness, power, and invulnerability, as if they were above the rules, above criticism, above others. Leaders with inflated egos begin by believing they are special, then that they are chosen, finally, that they are indispensable. Their words become dogmas, their mistakes justifiable, their decisions absolute. They confuse charisma with wisdom. They confuse applause with love. They confuse obedience with respect. Jung said, "Inflation is an illusory enlargement of personality, where the ego identifies with something greater, with an archetype, an ideal, power. That identification is what makes the inflated ego so dangerous, because the person no longer sees themselves as a limited, fallible, imperfect human being. In their own view, they become a channel of truth, justice, salvation, and that places them in an unquestionable position. But what causes this inflation? In many cases, it is fueled by an inner emptiness, a deep wound, often originating in childhood, feelings of rejection, insignificance, abandonment. Rather than face the pain, the person constructs a narcissistic armor, and that armor grows as they receive applause, adoration, power. The paradox is cruel. The more fragile the core, the more inflated the ego becomes, and the more inflated, the farther the individual drifts from their own soul. That is why Jung said that inflation is always accompanied by a loss of soul. The person disconnects from the symbolic dimension of life, from mystery, from introspection. They become purely solar, one-sided, dehumanized. And when that happens, they no longer lead. They dominate. But why do we follow people like this? Why do we entrust our confidence to such sick egos? Because the inflated ego seduces us. It conveys an image of certainty, strength, clarity. In a chaotic world, that is extremely tempting. Who has never longed for someone to speak with conviction, to tell us what to do, to promise security, direction, meaning, even if it is all an illusion? It is that illusion that keeps the inflated ego in power. It must be fed constantly by followers who do not question, by structures that do not confront it, by a crowd that projects onto it what it cannot find in itself. And the more we feed that ego, the more dangerous it becomes, because the inflated ego cannot tolerate frustration. It does not accept criticism. It does not recognize error. It would rather destroy the world around it than admit its own vulnerability. In times like these, leaders with inflated egos do not back down. They double down. They increase the volume, the intensity, the control, because internally they are desperate. The illusion of grandeur is all they have. If it collapses, they collapse along with it. And there is something even more unsettling. This dynamic does not occur only out there. It repeats itself within us. How many times have we inflated our own ego to hide a wound? How many times have we feigned self-sufficiency to avoid the discomfort of asking for help? How many times have we acted as if we knew everything, when deep down we were lost? What we see in the leaders of the world is often a mirror of what we cannot see in ourselves. And only when we become aware of that can we break the cycle. Because the inflated ego needs a blind audience to continue existing. And the path to healing begins when one by one eyes start to open, when the crowd rediscovers its own light and realizes that it no longer needs an external sun that burns everything around it. At this point arises the next element of this journey, projection. Because when the inflated ego presents itself as a solution, it is because someone, or many, projected onto it their own unclaimed power. Carl Jung stated clearly, all projection is a loss of soul. And that phrase, simple at first glance, carries immense weight, because to project is not merely to admire or identify, it is to deposit onto the other what we cannot integrate within ourselves. When we project, we surrender. We surrender our value, our potency, our wisdom, our sense of direction, and we expect, almost always unconsciously, that the other will take care of it for us. Now imagine this movement on a collective scale. Thousands, millions of people projecting onto a single figure everything they wish they could be, all the courage they lack, all the clarity they cannot access, all the steadfastness they fail to find internally. That figure then becomes a kind of savior, an icon, an archetype incarnate. And here lies the central point. It does not matter who this person really is. Projection is a phenomenon that happens in spite of the other. The constructed image is more important than their reality. It is idealized, inflated, elevated to a pedestal, which inevitably becomes an abyss. Jung said that projection occurs when we do not recognize something in ourselves, be it good or bad. We project light and shadow. We may intensely admire someone because they embody qualities we deny in ourselves: steadfastness, magnetism, vision, power. Just as we may intensely hate someone because they reflect what we cannot bear to see in the mirror. But when this projection occurs en masse, when an entire group surrenders its power to another, we have a dangerous phenomenon, the abdication of responsibility. It is no longer necessary to think for oneself, to feel for oneself, to choose for oneself. The leader thinks, feels, and decides, and the collective merely responds, applauds, or obeys. That is why so many inflated egos can maintain control for so long, because they are sustained by the projections of their followers. The more a community lacks a sense of meaning, the more it clings to external symbols, and the more a person disconnects from their self, the more they need an other to symbolize that lost center. This is the psychic root of fanaticism. When the projected figure is threatened, the psychic pain is profound, because it is not only the external person being questioned, it is the internal image built upon them. Projection becomes identity, and when that identity is wounded, the psyche reacts with violence, denial, blindness. Have you ever seen this happen? Someone defending a leader, a guru, an influencer blindly, even in the face of clear facts, even in the face of glaring contradictions? This is not stupidity. It is a defense mechanism. The collapse of projection threatens the person's internal structure, and to avoid facing that, they choose to cling even more to the illusion. But how do we break out of this cycle? Jung offers us a direction. To know oneself is the way to reclaim projections. When we look inward with honesty, we begin to perceive what we admired so much in the other, and why. Moreover, we begin to recover little by little the qualities we delegated. If we admire someone's steadfastness, perhaps it is time to cultivate our own. If we idolize another's clarity, perhaps we are avoiding the responsibility of listening to our own intuition. If we depend too much on another's strength, it is because we still do not trust our own. It is a delicate and often painful process, but it is only thus that we regain our soul, not as a return to the ego, but as a reconnection with the self. Now think of someone you once idealized deeply. It may have been a leader, a boss, a love interest. What exactly fascinated you? Which part of yourself did you project there and forget to develop within yourself? Projections show us where we remain divided, where fragments of our energy still lie scattered in the world, and the more whole we become, the less fascinated we are, not out of coldness, but out of clarity. We know how to admire without idolizing. We know how to love without blinding ourselves. We know how to follow without erasing ourselves. This is the beginning of the end of collective enchantment. When each person recovers their inner spark, the false shine of another loses its power. And this is precisely where the next element of this journey appears, the archetype of the puer aeternus, the eternal child, a figure that emerges with an enchanting, rebellious, almost messianic light, yet remains inside a prisoner of emotional immaturity. And it is he more than any other who occupies the throne when the collective psyche refuses to mature. Carl Jung used the term puer aeternus, the eternal youth, to describe a psychological type fixated on the promise of youth. Freedom, possibility, rebellion, genius, brilliance. He is light, spontaneous, full of ideas, but he is also inconstant, irresponsible, averse to commitments, incapable of dealing with frustration or limits. This archetype is not necessarily an external figure. He exists within all of us as an inner image. The problem arises when he dominates the personality, and even more when projected onto the collective, because the puer aeternus enchants. He symbolizes all that the common soul has forgotten: dream, impulse, rule-breaking. But when this figure rises to power, he brings a dangerous shadow, the refusal of reality. In politics, business, culture, the pure appears as the visionary, the outsider, the misunderstood genius. He speaks as if he were above institutions, as if he saw beyond time, as if he carried a truth the world has not yet understood. And that, of course, attracts, because in times of crisis, many seek exactly that, someone to bring novelty, rupture, salvation. But there is a fundamental detail. The puer does not want to grow. He wants to keep flying, without roots, without weight, without consequences, and that sooner or later exacts a price. Jung warns us that the shadow of the puer is emotional collapse, paralysis in the face of adult life. He may seem brilliant, but he cannot uphold reality. He cannot endure boredom, effort, the slow passage of time. His energy is unstable. It burns bright, but quickly extinguishes. And when confronted, he often reacts with drama, flight, or infantilized aggression. What is most unsettling is to perceive how many modern societies become infatuated with these figures: the immature messiah, the brilliant leader without emotional grounding, the visionary entrepreneur who cares for no one, the influencer who lives off catchy phrases but does not sustain deep relationships. Why do we follow this type? Because he carries something many have lost: fantasy. The promise that it is still possible to start from zero, tear everything down, reinvent the world. But that promise is empty, because there is no real transformation without maturity, without enduring pain, doubt, silence, without looking back, integrating the past, healing one's story. The puer speaks of a magical future, but ignores the wounds of the present. He distracts, he enchants, but he does not transform, and when he reaches power, with his uncommitted brilliance, he tends to produce reckless ruptures. He breaks structures without building others. He burns bridges without knowing how to return. He makes impulsive decisions with inspiring speeches, but with devastating consequences. And yet, we remain fascinated. Jung said, "The eternal youth has the gift of touching the soul with the promise of light, but often forgets that the soul also needs roots. Without roots, all light dissipates." This archetype should not be demonized. He is beautiful. He carries creativity, renewal, vital impulse. But he must be balanced by his opposite, the Ho. Senex, the old wise man, the principle of responsibility, patience, accumulated wisdom. When the pure dominates and the Senex is rejected, society becomes adolescent, impulsive, unstable, dangerous. And it is precisely that adolescent state we see repeating itself. Childlike leaders guiding emotional masses, fragile structures presented as revolutions, but without foundation, without roots, without real direction. True maturity is not the denial of the poor, it is its integration. It is allowing dream to dialogue with reality, inspiration to meet commitment, the brilliance of youth to find the ground of experience, and that begins within each of us. Because collective fascination exists only where individual refusal to grow persists, to assume limits, to accept the slowness of reality. If we want to transform how power manifests in the world, we must stop idealizing the eternal youth and begin to value those who sustain, with silence, humility, consistency, the weight of a life lived. Carl Jung devoted much of his work to individuation, the process of becoming who one truly is. It is an internal movement, long, often painful, in which the individual stops being merely a reflection of the collective and begins to listen to their own soul. To individuate is not to isolate oneself, not to become superior. It is to integrate. It is to acknowledge one's own shadow, to dialogue with the unconscious, to unmask the persona, to abandon projections and face the ego. It is a journey that demands courage and surrender, but in return offers real freedom. Individuation makes us less manipulable, less susceptible to charismatic leaders, empty promises, infantile polarizations, because one who is in the process of individuation does not seek salvation outside. One seeks integration within. For this very reason, societies that reject self-knowledge, that ridicule introspection, that trivialize silence and inner listening, tend to produce empty leaders, because a mass without contact with the self is guided by immediate impulses, and power ends up in the hands of those who shout the loudest, seduce the most, repeat what everyone wants to hear. It is not that the world produces foolish leaders, it chooses them, and chooses based on its own level of consciousness. Where there is no inner work, superficiality reigns. Where there is no confrontation with the shadow, projection reigns. Where there is no space for silence, noise reigns. Jung saw this clearly. He knew that the collective psyche, when asleep, becomes fertile ground for authoritarianism, fanaticism, mediocrity, because when the individual abdicates their own consciousness, someone always appears to occupy that space. And the most tragic part is that the process of individuation cannot be imposed. It is a choice, a solitary, intimate, non-transferable choice. One must want to look inward, and that, in times of hyperexposure, constant distraction, digital narcissism, is revolutionary. Jung said, "One who looks outside dreams, one who looks inside awakens." And that phrase invites us to a hard reflection. How many times have we looked outward in search of a savior, an ideal leader, someone to think for us, because we could not endure the silence within? When individuation is avoided en masse, the collective psyche weakens, it infantilizes, becomes reactive, dependent. And then, the stage is set. All it takes is a character with a good mask, a well-tuned shadow, an inflated ego, and a puerile discourse, and to be acclaimed. This internal collapse is the true reason why the most foolish ascend to power. They are symptoms, symptoms of a world that has lost contact with its own soul. But there is a way out. There always is. Because individuation can begin now, here with you. No matter your age, your history, your past, the call to awaken is silent, yet constant. It reveals itself in small unrests, in the questions you try to avoid, in the discomforts that repeat. It is the self knocking at the door. The journey begins when you stop asking, "Who will guide me?" and start asking, "What within me have I not yet heard?" You have come this far, which, in itself, says much. While the world is distracted by surface glimmers, you chose to dive deep. While many follow external voices, you began to listen to your own. And that is the beginning of something real. Today you saw that empty power is not born by chance. It arises from the mirror of our collective unconscious. That behind inflated leaders there are crowds projecting their own light. That too often it is easier to give our own strength to another than to take the risk of being whole. But you also saw that there is another path. A more difficult path, yes, but infinitely more true. The path of individuation, the return to center, the reclaiming of the soul. Jung showed us that transforming the world begins with the awakened individual, not through speeches, but through silent choices, through the courage to look within, to integrate the shadow, to remove the mask, to stand up without applause and nevertheless walk on. And if there is something this video wanted to remind you of, it is this. You do not need perfect leaders. You need yourself. True authority is born when you cease abandoning yourself. And if this content has kindled in you a spark, a recognition, a fertile discomfort, I invite you to stay, to walk alongside, to delve deeper on this journey of consciousness, integration, and truth. Here, every video is a mirror, every word an invitation, every silence a door. So subscribe, not merely to receive content, but to uphold a commitment, to no longer live asleep. Because when a soul awakens, the whole world begins to change.